Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, it's not new, unfortunately, and that's the government shutdown that we just avoided. Well, I shouldn't say avoided. I think it might be coming back, or at least a threat of it will be coming back in a few days, few weeks.
45 days. That's the new normal. Every 45 days we do this nonsense.
I don't know what's wrong with people's memories, but it seems that no one can remember events past 6 months. On average, it's about every, whatever it is, 6 to 8 months, Congress does this. They hit the debt ceiling, and then one party or the other threatens to shut down the government. And sometimes they do, and when they do, what gets shut down? Nothing that costs real money. It's all stuff that's visible. So they'll close down the Washington Monument. You can't go in there, right? Because the government shut down. It actually costs them more money to shut it down than it does to leave it open.
Well, let me ask you this, because the thing that we hear most often, and we do hear this all the time, is, oh my God, Social Security checks won't go out.
Yeah.
When's the last time that happened?
You know, that's a good question. If my memory serves correctly, it happened once, meaning once since Social Security was instituted, and even then, it wasn't because of a shutdown. It was some kind of computer glitch that delayed the checks by a couple days or something.
So if we're not actually worried about Social Security checks not going out, and look, I get that. That's a legitimate worry, right? There's a lot of people out there who literally depend month to month on Social Security to live. So, okay, a reasonable fear. But it's only a reasonable fear if it might happen. Evidence matters, right? And if you've got scores of years to draw your evidence from, and the thing you worry about never actually happens, it's probably never going to happen.
Yeah, but what is going to happen is that politicians are going to say publicly, oh, we can't shut down the government because Social Security checks won't go out. And they all know that that's not going to happen. What they're doing is using this as a way to get in front of the cameras, to leverage themselves politically, whatever it is. But this is all theater. I mean, we've used the analogy of theater before, and my God, it fits so well. There's nothing real going on here.
Well, there is something real going on here, right? Because every time this happens, spending gets curtailed, and then the minute there's an agreement, all that backspending gets made yet again.
Yeah, and here's the thing that people think. They think that when the government shuts down, when they hit the debt ceiling limit, that government spending stops until they come to some budget agreement. And of course, when they do come to a budget agreement, everybody appears in front of the cameras saying we can turn government back on, all of this. And if you look at the government debt numbers, the debt number flatlines when they hit the ceiling. And as soon as that ceiling is lifted, it jumps. It jumps to the same level it would have been at had the debt ceiling never been hit.
So literally every dime that was going to get spent gets spent anyway. It just gets delayed a week or two.
Oh, it does. And, people will say things like, well, these poor federal workers who aren't getting paid, they are absolutely getting paid. They're just going to get their checks retroactively when the spending caps are lifted and the government gets back into business.
And I'm willing to say here, too, that might actually present a difficulty to those people.
Right.
If I don't get my paycheck, we're going to have a problem. I think everybody would say that. Then again, it's not like they don't get paid. They just get paid a week late.
So what's happening is there's monies being shifted around on the books in the back end, but none of this matters. It's all political showmanship.
We are exactly as irresponsible as we have ever been.
And you might ask the question, if none of this has any real effect on anything, why do we keep doing it? And on average, it's happening every 6 to 8 months for decades now. And the reason is politicians are very much like Hollywood movie stars. They need to keep their faces in front of the people. They need to remain relevant in the people's eyes. This is an opportunity. If this can happen every 3 months, they'd love it to happen every 3 months, as long as they could get their faces in front of the cameras.
For those of us out there who are unfortunately on political email lists, they all use this as an opportunity to fundraise.
Oh, yes. Send us money now before the government shuts down, or to keep it shut down, whichever side you're on.
That's right. I get both. And I don't know why I get both, because I've signed up for neither. These are mean-spirited listeners out there who routinely sign me up for this nonsense. Well, what can you do? I guess this is the cost of having a podcast. But come on, man, give me a break. This is just ridiculous. Every rational person knows it. The problem is that rational people are nowhere to be found. Rational people go find better things to do than worry about this nonsense. Our national press is populated by fools, rogues, and morons.
But if you think about it, they've got the same incentive that the politicians do, which is they want to stay in front of people's faces to remain relevant.
That's right. But here's the thing. What I want from the national press is honest reporting. And I'm not getting it. I haven't gotten it for decades. If you're out there thinking, yeah, but Fox, yeah, but MSNBC, just stop. These are not news outlets. This is infotainment at best. I've taken to watching the BBC almost exclusively. Because it's great? No, but because it's considerably better. And that's kind of sad. I would rather be watching American news. I just don't know where to get it.
Well, that's an interesting thing. It's maybe worth an episode. I hate to say what I'm about to say, but BBC, to my knowledge, is not funded by advertising. It's funded by government.
It's funded by taxpayers. That's right. As luck would have it, it's funded by British taxpayers, so I don't have to pay for it.
Now, an economist, particularly a free market economist, would point to that as a negative and say, well, that's a media, it's not profit-oriented, so you're not getting the best thing. And I would say, because it's not profit-oriented, they've got the ability to give you the news as opposed to whatever it is that they think is going to attract your eyeballs.
And, people often ask, well, okay, smart guy, where do you get your news? And the answers are probably going to surprise people. Every day I start with NPR's Up First, which I think is a fantastic podcast, 20 minutes or so, and I get an overview of the day's news, and it's pretty good. Then on the TV, I watch the BBC. When I want to read, it's the Christian Science Monitor for international things, very typically, and the Wall Street Journal for domestic things.
Yeah, and I've started to take a liking to Bloomberg Magazine. Well, I don't know if it's called Bloomberg Magazine, but you get Bloomberg.com. Their articles are pretty straightforward.
I mean, we're always in search of the right answer, and it's hard to find. And I think the best I can do right now is to cobble things together. If listeners are out there and they're thinking, oh, I know a great news source, please send it along. I would love to take a look. Hoping and praying that somebody's going to cover the federal budget with anything approaching honesty is just asking too much. Although I will say in the last Republican debate, we got some verbiage on the debt. I was absolutely shocked to see it. This is the first time we've really gotten any serious talk about the debt ever, as near as I can remember, or at least since Reagan was in office, when the deficits were spiraling out of control at amounts that we would now refer to as cute. We don't really get a whole lot of coverage, but all of a sudden Republicans are willing to talk about it, and they seem willing, given the political vagaries of the presidential campaign. They seem willing to talk about the fact that one of their own, Donald Trump, added to this problem quite significantly. This wouldn't happen if he weren't such a damaged candidate and way out in front nonetheless. I understand why they're doing it, but that they're doing it at all is a minor miracle. Speaking of problems that are never going to go away, we should probably mention what's happening in Israel right now. And out of an abundance of respect for what's happening there, there will be no foolishness of the week this week. We've seen what's been called, I think correctly so, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It's about to get a whole lot worse. You've got this massive attack from Hamas into Israel, and now you're about to see the massive counterattack by Israel into Gaza. Clearly, what we have here is the state of Iran funneling money to Hamas, which then attacked Israel, and this was a massive attack. I don't see an end in sight to this one. Israel has declared a state of war. I can't see how they would do anything else. The Arab states have been remarkably silent.
That's very telling.
It is very telling. I think we were at a point where almost every state in the Middle East was ready to normalize relations with Israel. I mean, that was clear. And this is that last-ditch attempt to upend that kind of lasting peace. What happens next? Hey, that's anybody's guess. But the carnage that I'm seeing in Israel right now is astonishing. Men, women, and children. It was just indiscriminate killing. People are being dragged out of their homes. Naked women are being paraded through the streets. It's beyond barbaric. If you think for 1 second there won't be a retaliation in kind, an exponential retaliation in kind, you haven't been paying attention. Ask yourself, why would Hamas do this knowing that a massive retaliation in kind would doubtlessly occur?
They want a massive retaliation?
That's exactly what they want. They know that's what's going to happen. Therefore, that's what they want. So they want a massive attack on their own people.
Which then justifies continued hostilities because they can point to the Israelis killing women and children.
And that's where we are. There's really no winning here. There's just degrees of losing.
Yeah.
As is so often the case with these sorts of things. But the Palestinians will lose to a far greater degree than the Israelis. This is, I think, the saddest thing I've seen in at least a decade.
As you're talking about this, I'm getting memories from when I was a kid watching the same kind of thing going on in the Middle East between, I think it was the Israelis and the Syrians at the time.
If you were a kid, it was the 73 war. But ask yourself what it looks like when water, food, and power are cut off to 2 million people. You're going to have a humanitarian catastrophe on your hands right now.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
So we got some hate mail, Ant, as we are known to receive. And this is from a gentleman named Paul Wilness. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So, Paul, if you're out there, thanks for the hate mail. It was actually very polite hate mail, so that's always appreciated. But I'm going to read it in full. It's not that long. And it'll give an idea of what we're getting at this week.
Before you start, let me underline, this was really good hate mail. This is the kind that we take seriously and respond to, as we're going to do now.
Well, it was first-class hate mail. I really do enjoy more the ones who say that I'm in league with Satan and I'm going to burn in hell for all eternity. Those are way more fun, but this is a way better hate mail. So, nonetheless, without further ado, I will couch this a little by saying, this is from my memory of your podcast. I try to listen to each one, but my backlog of podcasts is extensive, so I may have missed a few. We don't hold that against you, Paul. But I don't think that impacts the following. Similarly, my memory is average at best, but this is not a one-off. I think we're going to give you that, but we're going to require that you give us exactly the same in return. Our memory, not so great, but we're going to do the best with what we've got. So here's where it gets serious. You've patted yourselves on the back for admitting when you're wrong, but there seems to be some dishonest gaps. I'm not sure how much is protecting your brand and how much is psychological protection of self or honest error, but I'm too cynical to buy that. Well, I'm here to tell you it's honest error, generally speaking. Be cynical, be not cynical. That's where I'm coming down, but we'll get to it as we go.
That's interesting because I read that and I thought some of it is protecting the brand, but we can talk about that when we get to it.
I don't know that we have a brand to protect, but we could talk about that when we get to it. Paul continues, 2 topics, he says. Both of you have been credulous in regards to the COVID vaccines and masking. He actually puts vaccines in quotation marks, which sets me back on my heels a little bit. They are, in fact, vaccines. I don't know why it would be in quotation marks, but nonetheless, to the point of being downright insulting to those of us who didn't mask or take the so-called vaccine. I don't know that that's true. Maybe it is. Now, we're far beyond 2020, and those of us who have employed basic reason and listened to actual experts, not talking heads, were right. Many studies globally have proven what was known since the conclusion of the Spanish flu and what actual experts have said. Wearing a mask for COVID is the equivalent of trying to stop mosquitoes with a chain link fence. Furthermore, they may present even greater overall health risk. Should we stop right here for a moment?
Yeah, I wanted to point out here, this email came in before our episode aired with Brian McCannon talking about his research into the deleterious effects of masks.
Which is exactly the point that Paul makes here.
Right, yeah.
I think Brian came on and agreed with what Paul just said. Now, I don't know that I agree with Brian. I don't know that I agree with Paul. I don't know that I agree with much of anyone. But I do think it's interesting and even necessary that we have what I would call reasonable opinions represented on the podcast.
Right. Right.
So do I agree with everything Brian said? I don't know that I do. I haven't thought everything through all the way. And given what I do for a living and what Brian does for a living, I might never think them through all the way.
Let's stop right there for a second. You said you don't necessarily agree with everything Brian said, which does not mean you disagree with it.
No, that's correct.
You can not agree and be perfectly agnostic.
I'm agnostic on the matter.
Yep.
And if we go back in time, and I haven't gone back and re-listened to every podcast that we did during the COVID times, but I'm damn near positive. And notice I'm qualifying it even now, but I'm positive that I never said anything about the necessity of wearing a mask to stop the spread of the disease. I repeatedly said that I wear a mask to make my fellow citizens feel better.
I do recall you saying that many times, and following it up with, I don't know whether it works or not, but if it makes everybody else feel comfortable, fine.
Yeah, and I honestly hated wearing them.
Yeah.
I absolutely hated wearing them. I went out of my way to find products that allowed me to breathe easier while appearing to wear a mask.
Unmasked.com.
Unmasked.com. For those of you who are being stuck with more masking mandates wherever you might happen to be, and I do see them popping up, one would hope that we're past that at this point. I really hated the masks.
Yeah.
And I do wonder whether they did any good at all. Now, Brian came on and said they might have done more harm than good. I don't know, maybe they did more harm than good, but I think it's at least reasonable to conclude that this was a wash, that it probably didn't do much of anything, if it did anything at all.
At the least, yeah. Yeah.
So there you go. I think it's a little trickier to look at vaccines. And I say this only because I know for a fact that vaccines are one of the greatest scientific advancements that human beings have ever come up with.
Right. And to Paul's email, and Paul puts the vaccines in quotes, look, there's no question the COVID vaccine is a vaccine. Now, the question as to whether it's efficacious, that's another point.
And it seems to be actually quite efficacious. Now, efficacious enough to make everybody happy. And I think probably not. And I think we're left now with the new social realities that we have, that in order to make everything happy, everything would have to work 100% of the time with no side effects.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
And in the world of medicine, you don't get that, but nonetheless.
Now, let me back up Paul here for a second, because he references the CDC. The CDC did come out recently, within the past month, with a statement that it appears that those who have received the COVID vaccine are more susceptible to the next variant of the COVID disease. Now, that doesn't mean that the COVID vaccine was somehow not efficacious against the original variant, but it is saying, look, there may be this side effect that you're worse off in the future. And I don't know. I'm just quoting what CDC said.
That would be interesting. And I would be interested in seeing more of that.
Yeah.
That would seem to be a real problem. And then it seems if that's true, we might end up with a situation in which we're chasing our tails forever. So what happens because you're more at risk? You develop a new vaccine, which puts you more at risk next year for the new variant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, all right. Who knows?
Right.
We said this all the way through. We're not doctors. We're not epidemiologists. We're applying the tools of our respective trades to the things that are happening right now. an economist and a political scientist can actually conclude a few things when they start looking at things outside of their disciplines.
Yeah, and let me say something about Brian McCannon in his episode a couple of weeks back, because a couple of people said something to us along those same lines. Look, Brian McCannon is an economist. He's not an epidemiologist. What does he know about whether masks are efficacious? And you have to be careful here, because his study was not asking the question, is the mask efficacious against the disease? What he was asking was, is it the case that when the government required masks, that the COVID death rate went up or down? And you don't need to be an epidemiologist to ask that question. You just have to be a data analyst.
What you find here, and I'm not accusing Paul of this at all, but this is something that you and I get quite a lot. People think they know the question that we asked.
Yes.
I got this on Twitter the other night. I got blasted for allegedly saying something in an article I wrote about Google and antitrust and what have you. Now, it just so happens that I do agree largely with what I was accused of saying. Not completely, but largely. But I didn't write the article.
Oh, you didn't even write the article?
No, I was taken out back and beaten for an article someone else wrote.
For something someone else wrote.
We get this kind of thing a lot, and when academics reply to each other, they generally don't do this. When people who are not academics reply to academics, they watch the news and they get a framing for an issue, and then they read what an academic wrote, and it's not framed in that way, and they apply the prior framing to the way the academic wrote about the thing. And that's generally where misunderstanding comes from when academics delve into public policy.
Yeah, and this is the big problem when you're reading about a study rather than reading the study itself. You're not seeing the details that are very important. Instead, you're seeing what the author's perception of the details were, or more likely, what the author's perception of some other author's perception of the details were.
So Paul continues, frankly, I resent that I need to engage in politics, and red team versus blue team is downright cancerous. I am also no Trump fanboy, though the country is objectively better during his presidency. Well, I'm not so sure of that. I don't think that that's any kind of slam dunk. You have to ask a million different questions about that. And on some superficial levels, yes, it was. On other superficial levels, you're better off under Biden. On a much deeper level, you're going to get rather different answers. And I don't know that we've got the time for that, but let's continue. There was praise for Biden, saying he can't rule by executive orders, hope and change, and that sort of thing. I have found your imbalance in criticizing over the years the big toe versus Biden beyond strange, including Biden since ruling by executive order. I don't know if it's protecting your the president has little impact on the market brand or what. As I lead, I'm not much for politics, unlike the objective facts around COVID. I'm readily willing to admit I'm wrong, but the mocking, insulting years calling out the big toe has in no way matched with who is the absolute worst, I'd argue, traitorous president in American history. All right, that's just ridiculous. To think that Joe Biden is the worst, even a traitorous president, is absolutely ridiculous. There are so many worse presidents than Joe Biden. I don't even know where to begin. Go back and start with Andrew Johnson and work forward from there, maybe. But look at what we're getting into here.
Yeah, and this criticism hit home with me a little bit because I think there is a bit of brand protection here. Maybe protection's the wrong word. It is the case that our listeners tend toward the right. And it's not, you and I make a big deal about trying to remain nonpartisan and calling out the left and the right equally, but I've noticed this problem in our writing, in my email interactions with other people, and with the podcast as well. And I'm going to speak very, very broadly here. Generally speaking, people who self-identify to the right, when they disagree with us, are willing to engage and listen. People on the left, broadly speaking, when they engage with us, tend not to want to listen. And so understanding that our audience tends toward the right, I tend to be much more hard on rightist politicians than on leftist politicians because the audience is generally going to agree with pretty much anything we say to detract from leftist politicians. But they're going to tend to want to defend those on the right. And so I tend to hit that harder.
I don't fall into any of the description you just offered of yourself. Frankly, I don't think of Trump as a right-leaning politician. I don't know how you would. I mean, he's a Republican, or at least he said he was, and he ran as one. But to think of him as a right-leaning politician, I think is absurd.
Well, I don't think in the historical sense of right-left, I don't think any politician on either side satisfies the definitions. They're all authoritarians. They're just authoritarians in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. The modern day progressives, I think, are all authoritarians. You don't find the Daniel Patrick Moynihan leftist out there anymore.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to imagine who would even come closest to fitting that bill. There was a time when I think the left was respectable in the United States. That time has long passed, but so too the right. And I don't find any solace with one group or the other. I don't like Joe Biden. I don't like Donald Trump. I don't know how anybody could conclude that I did. I think by and large, these men are morally unqualified to lead the United States.
I think something else that's important here is that we tended to hit Trump hard, but in part because he was president at the time we were doing it.
That's right.
If you go back to the Obama years, but I know in our editorials, we were hitting Obama hard, but it was simply because that's who was in the White House.
And we don't hit Joe Biden as hard, I think. And I think if you did some kind of quantitative analysis of what we've done, you'd come to this conclusion. We don't hit Joe Biden as hard because Joe Biden didn't try to do as much.
Yeah.
He just doesn't try to do much. Joe Biden is more of a caretaker president than the average caretaker president.
Yeah. Student loan forgiveness is about the only thing that's got his signature on it. And even then, that seems to be a half-hearted attempt.
Anyway, this email, he says, overall, I enjoy your podcast and I bookmarked several episodes. I adore Mr. Reed Leary for pushing the discussion and cultivation of character, but the aforementioned needs to be said. Well, okay, you've said it, we've responded to it, but we take it even more seriously than that because we asked our listeners, hey, can you think of anything else we've been wrong about that we didn't admit to down the road? And we figured we could cop to everything right away. And predictably, that conversation deteriorated into one about vaccines and mask mandates pretty quickly.
That seems to be the big thing. I'd say 75%. Oh, and by the way, to fill in listeners, what happened is Paul sent us this wonderful email. James took it very seriously, went to Words and Numbers Backstage on Facebook, where our fans come and listen and talk about things, and posted on there and said, look, we got this email. Tell us, what do you think we've been wrong about that we haven't admitted to? And as James says, 75% of it is masks and vaccine.
And I think we've just covered that to whatever extent we can. So we're going to sweep that aside, but there were other things.
Yeah, I'll throw this one out. Dan Reed says, you were not, pretty much you, James, you were not one iota right about Lincoln.
Well, it would have been helpful if he had said what I was wrong about, but I could kind of guess. Libertarians have a tortured relationship with Abraham Lincoln. They do not like him at all. And I think there are pretty good reasons for that, right? So if you read the Declaration of Independence, what do you learn? You learn that a group of people can get together and decide to secede. That's what the Americans did when confronted with what they considered to be an untenable situation with the English. So why then, the question goes, shouldn't the American South have been allowed to secede? And we're only talking about secession here. I'm not talking about slavery or anything of the kind. Should they have been permitted to secede? And I think the logical answer to that question is yes. If the logic of the Declaration holds and is true for all people at all times, well, then why not? You're left with that question. But ask yourself, what would you have done if you were Abraham Lincoln and a bunch of the country seceded before you even took office?
Right.
What are you going to do? And now I'm not so sure what I would do. This has always been my point with Lincoln, that I can consider secession without considering it solely in terms of slavery, although the Civil War was absolutely about slavery. If slavery didn't exist, that war never happened.
Do you think that? I've heard you say that before, but in my mind, I keep thinking, okay, let's suppose there was no slavery in the South. It seems to me we would have encountered some issue at which the South says that's enough, we're leaving, or somebody says that's enough, we're leaving.
No. You encounter some issue that pisses somebody off all the time, right? The question is, do you piss a state off or a number of states off hard enough to say we're out of this union? And without slavery? No, of course not.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that there is no other issue that would have arisen that could have had the same outcome of civil war.
In a nation founded on the very principle of human equality, chattel slavery is the greatest evil that there can be. It's just that simple, right? And you can't have a nation based on equality, yet enslaving a significant portion of its own people, being viable over time. It's not going to work. You've got an inherent contradiction at the heart of things. And that's going to fail every time. It's going to take forever, as we found out, 7 years, to get to that point, but it just couldn't work anymore. So what happened has often been referred to as the price America had to pay in blood for its hypocrisy. And I think that's essentially what it was. So, were I Lincoln? And this is the interesting question, right? Not intellectually with 150 years of hindsight, do I know what the right answer is? No. The more interesting question is, were I Lincoln at that moment, what would I have done?
Right.
And now I'm not so sure I would have done anything any differently than he did. I'm just being honest here. Do I think that the logic of the Declaration holds in all instances? Yeah, actually I do. Would I have lived up to that were I president at the time? Not so sure. And that's about me as much as it's about anything else. But I'm not so sure anybody would live up to it, given the stakes.
No, and let me point to one of the darlings of the libertarians, Thomas Jefferson, with the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was clearly unconstitutional. And yet he went ahead and did it anyway. And as you say, had I been in this situation, I probably would have done the same thing. That was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that the country could not afford to not do.
And I don't think that matters or holds on this consideration at all. When we look at the Declaration, we're looking at natural rights. When we look at the Constitution, we're not.
Sure, it's a step down. It's a step down.
It is. I'm just saying I don't know what I would have done. What I am willing to say is there was no winning answer. No matter what you chose, there was going to be a problem. It's not like there was a backdoor to happiness that somehow an entire generation missed.
Yes.
That didn't happen. So, was I wrong about everything about Lincoln? Well, only if I'm wrong about everything about Lincoln right now. But see, I wasn't going to cover Dan's because really Dan's is more about an opinion than about what we would call objective facts that you could literally be wrong about. We can disagree about Lincoln all day long. I'll tell Dan he's wrong, right, colloquially, but I realize that he's got an opinion that I don't share, and that's a little different than saying, look, you got this vaccine thing wrong, which you can go and test for and find out.
And this is one of the problems I've noted with libertarians, and it's both endearing and frustrating. It's both libertarian strength and weakness, that they take principle seriously. And I think that's wonderful. Absolutely, you need to take principle seriously. But you also have to consider practicality. And sometimes you throw the baby out with the bathwater if you adhere too closely to principle. I'm not saying we should just ignore principle wantonly, but you've got to strike that balance, and libertarians are horrible at striking that balance. But having said that, I think people on the left and the right are also horrible at striking that balance, only they go the opposite direction.
But ask yourself, why doesn't the Libertarian Party ever win anything? It's because they cling to principle far, far too much. A principle of politics is that we have to win an election. There's nothing wrong with that. When you give up all your other principles to service only that principle, now you've got a problem. And I suspect both of the main parties have done that.
But when you give up that principle of winning elections in favor of the others, you don't win elections.
And not only that, but you become laughable. And libertarians are unfortunately very, very good at having contests of libertarian purity. Are you libertarian enough for this, for that, et cetera, et cetera? The answer is always no, by the way, regardless of who's being considered. But they're very bad at just about everything else. So we did get this one thing in the middle of everything that I thought was a little interesting. And every now and then you and I disagree. But your belief about mutual aid societies as a forerunner of medical insurance, how maybe we should just do things that way. And you have always fallen back on this, as opposed to welfare, say. And I never have. I just don't think this idea is going to help at all. And we get a little bit of this coming through in our criticisms.
Yeah, the idea is that the government put the end to mutual aid societies by instituting the welfare state. That the mutual aid societies, these private organizations, couldn't compete with quote-unquote free. Now, we had an episode with Christy Ford Chapin who said, no, it wasn't the government, at least not the government directly. It was the American Medical Association that called for all sorts of restrictions on who could and could not provide medical care that caused the end of the mutual aid societies.
So it's still going to be the government.
Yes.
Right, because you've got the AMA calling on the government to regulate certain things. But this is regulatory capture at its finest. It begins with the AMA.
Right, yes, as opposed to beginning with a welfare state.
And there was another one that was somewhat similar to this one. And this one actually makes me feel especially stupid. I think this was the one I hated the most. You and I talk about the Cobra effect so much that we're planning on writing a book about the Cobra effect, only to find out there might not be any such thing as the Cobra effect.
Yeah, and this actually almost caused us a huge problem because we had it in our book.
Yes.
The Cobra effect. And the book was past its final editing. And I had to frantically write the editor and say, no, you got to take this piece out.
That's right. We removed, I think, 3 sentences or some such thing.
Right. I was trying to do my best to remove it with making as few changes as possible. But here's the thing.
Well, this is one of those things that, quote, everybody knows, unquote.
Right. You got to be so careful about those. The Cobra effect is this story that in India, being inundated with cobras, and the government put out a bounty on them, and consequently people started raising them to take them in to get the bounty, and you had more cobras at the end. That's the story. And this is repeated so much, at least in our circles, that of course we're doing a chapter on unintended consequences, so we put this into the chapter. In fact, we started with it. And right before the book went to press, one of our listeners wrote us and said, hey, you guys might want to check that out. I don't think the Cobra effect actually is a thing. And I laughed when I saw it. I said, who's this guy? Of course, the Cobra effect is a thing, but just for giggles, I started looking. And there it is. There's the reference in Freakonomics to the Cobra problem. In fact, with a footnote. So I tracked down the footnote, and the footnote cited somebody else, and this somebody else cited Freakonomics. Or not Freakonomics, but one of the authors of Freakonomics prior to Freakonomics being published. And all of a sudden I said, oh my God, it's a circular argument. There is no, at least I could not find any original source for that story.
That's right. There was another story.
But thankfully, you, James, came to the rescue because you had a story that you were telling for some time about rats in Vietnam. Very similar thing, and we could find the source data for that.
It was the same story, that there were too many rats, and the government said, kill the rats, cut off the tail, bring us the tail. Well, people cut the tail off and let the rats loose.
Yeah.
What do you know?
Yeah.
It had a happy ending for us, but not for the Vietnamese and their rats. Maybe not for the Indians and their cobra problem, if they ever, in fact, had a cobra problem. But all's well that ends well, because we didn't write anything truly stupid in our book.
I've got one I want to talk about here, and this goes to me. Quinn Lennon quoted me as saying that 4% inflation is going to be the new norm. And he points out to our recent inflation numbers and says, okay, so where's the 4% inflation? And in fact, I went and pulled the data just before we started recording here, monthly data on inflation. And if you look at the 6-month moving average, so inflation's up and down, but what's the average for the past 6 months? This average has been below 4% since March of this year. Now, on the one hand, I can say, yeah, if you look at least the last 6 months of data since March of this year, it appears that I was wrong, that 4% is not the new norm. However, all the indications are, as of right now, that this below 4% was temporary and we're headed back up again. So we need to revisit this question a year from now. There's simply not enough information at this point to be able to say whether I was right or not right.
And I don't know, I've been paying attention to this too. The Fed's stated goal is to keep inflation at about 2%.
That's right.
And we've been well above that for a while, and we're reverting to form. The question is, do we get all the way back to 2%? And that's an open question given the data that I've been seeing. It looks like we might be actually settling in at about 2.8 to 3%, something in that range. So who knows?
I want to make sure that people hold my feet to the fire here, because I said 4% and other times I've said 5 to 10%. If I am right, let me say it differently. Before anyone says Davies was right, we need to see at least 4% on a sustained basis.
And sustained would probably be a couple of years.
At least one, yeah.
Given the way these things work, it's probably going to be a couple of years. And I don't know that we're going to get to 4 anytime soon, not regularly. I think there will come a time when we look back and think, wow, 4, that would be great right now. We're certainly not at any of these points, so we'll have to see how it all plays out.
One for you, James. Luke McCormick.
Probably the last one that we'll get to today, and a good one to end on.
Well, I've got a big one to fess up to here in a moment.
Go ahead with yours, because the Luke McCormick one's going to take a minute.
Okay. Several people have called me to task from time to time over the past 18 months about the way I describe inflation occurring in the relationship between the money supply and inflation. And what's happened here are a couple of things. One, the Federal Reserve altered the banking rules. Some people may know the term fractional reserve. The fractional reserve system that we've lived under for decades ceased to exist round about May of 2020. We're on what's called an ample reserve system. And what that means, among other things, is that the Fed's tools for controlling monetary policy no longer involve altering the money supply. It's just interest rates. And there's probably 500 footnotes to that few sentences I just said. But it's a complete sea change in how the Fed goes about conducting monetary policy. So that's one of the things that's going on. But then there's this other thing, and I guess the thing I'm admitting to that I got wrong is not making that transition from fractional reserve to ample reserves. I kept talking for a long time in terms of fractional reserve system using the Fed's old tools. So that's the part I got wrong. But there's another piece here that people get wrong who criticize me on this point. And that is, it doesn't matter what the rules are about how the Fed does or does not handle monetary policy. What matters in the long run is the ratio of the number of dollar bills to the number of goods and services. And that, in the long run, is where inflation comes from. All this other stuff is important, but it's important in a shorter run or medium run regime. When you talk about inflation over the long haul, decades, it's the only thing that matters are those two animals. How much money is in the system and how much goods and services are you producing?
And like everybody else who's listening, I'm almost half asleep now.
Let's finish with Luke McCormick, and this is directed more at you than me, says Reagan wasn't nearly as popular as we claimed. This was in an episode that we recorded out at the Reagan Ranch, actually, maybe a year ago. And I thought I was pretty clear when I talked about Reagan's popularity. I said as measured by the electoral votes. Now, you can argue whether the electoral votes are the right metric, but going by that metric, we have not seen a president bring in that fraction of electoral votes since George Washington.
Twice.
And Luke pointed at the popular vote and said, look at the popular vote. Reagan wasn't that great. In fact, Kennedy had more fraction of the popular vote than Reagan did. Yes, that's correct. But when it comes to electing a president, the popular vote doesn't matter. That's not how we elect presidents. We elect them with electoral votes.
Yeah, that's right. The popular vote is something invented by the press to be able to talk about things in terms of a horse race, but it literally doesn't matter and never has. Now, you can make an argument that it should, but even if it started mattering, say, in the next election, that we're going to use the popular vote from here on out, that doesn't mean you could go back in history and draw conclusions from previous popular votes. You can't. The obvious reason is this. If you're in a state and one candidate is going to win it quite handily and you don't have to worry about it, you stay home and you don't vote, right? If, on the other hand, the popular vote matters, you go vote. The rules determine the outcome in no small part. So careful when you think about going into the past and rewriting the rules of the game. But it's interesting because Luke McCormick said an interesting thing, and I don't have his comment open in front of me. He said that there were presidents who were at least as, if not more popular than Reagan was. Well, here's the thing. I've got a couple of different things right now, and I've got the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research with presidential approval highs and lows. Let's just talk about the high point for a moment, right? And the highest popularity Ronald Reagan ever had was 68%. That's actually pretty good given what we get now, which is very typically in the mid to high 40s. Mm-hmm. Trump and Biden have both been bouncing around 45 to 48 for a lot of their presidencies. Reagan hit 68%. But listen to this. I'm going to go backwards in time. Carter, 75. Ford, 71. Nixon, 70. Johnson 80, Kennedy 83, Eisenhower 78, Truman 87, Roosevelt 84. Literally every president back to Franklin D. Roosevelt had a higher high than Ronald Reagan did.
Right.
Do you think for 1 second that they were more popular than Reagan was? Please. That doesn't even pass the smell test. I can make it even funnier by going the other direction. George H.W. Bush, 89. Bill Clinton, 73. George W. Bush, 92. Barack Obama.
George W. Bush, the one-term president. Oh, no, George W. was the two-term president. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, but he was 92 the week after 9/11.
Right, sure.
And see, you have to remember these sorts of things. Why was the high point the high point?
Yeah.
So W. Bush, 92, Barack Obama, 76, Donald Trump, 49, and Joe Biden, 63. The only two presidents that Ronald Reagan was not less popular than, Biden and Trump. Now, that's not right. That's ridiculous.
So in Luke's defense here, all told, I want to say that Luke's criticism is correct here. The problem is sloppiness on our part, or at least my part, in using the term popular. Reagan was popular. What does that mean? We were looking at the electoral vote.
Hang on. Let's go to the other side of this coin. Lowest percentage. All right. Reagan's lowest percentage is 35. Now let's go backwards as we did before. Carter, 28. Ford, 37. Nixon, 23. Johnson, 35. Kennedy, 56. Eisenhower, 48. Truman, 22. Franklin Roosevelt, 48. All right, that's at best a mixed bag. The other direction, H.W. Bush, 29, Clinton, 36, W. Bush, 19. So W. Bush has...
19! W. Bush is the one that got 92 on the high end.
That's right. He was the most and least popular president of the last 100 years. Barack Obama, 37, Trump, 29, Biden, 31.
Yeah.
All right. Which of those two columns are we supposed to be using?
Yeah, and here's the problem. What do you mean by popular?
That's right. And generally speaking, we only have the one way of determining popularity with presidents, and that's by elections. I don't think George H.W. Bush was particularly popular. He's a one-term president. Why would I? So too Jimmy Carter, not particularly popular. Even Gerald Ford, who I think was a good and honorable man, but not a particularly popular president. That doesn't mean I don't think he was a good one. I do think he was a good one. I think he was exactly what America needed at the moment he happened to show up. Popular? No. Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, insanely popular. And in 1980, won an election with 44 states carried. 44. Jimmy Carter won 6 states in the District of Columbia. And it was an even bigger drubbing when he ran against Mondale later. I think Mondale only won Minnesota, his home state, and D.C. That's it. Reagan won 49 of 50 states.
Yep.
So I'm going to dig in my heels a little bit on that one. You've kind of ameliorated your position a little bit on that one. Hopefully it's enough to make Luke happy. I don't know if it will be or not, but there you go. That's the best we're going to do. And that, I think, Ant, is not a bad rundown of blameworthy things for which we've been both charged and indicted, I might say.
That's true. And I want to go back and thank again Paul Wilness. He put a lot of effort into this email, for his wonderful email calling us to task on things we've done wrong.
He did. And Paul, I hope you realize we put almost as much effort into this response to you as you put into your initial email. So thanks. And we hope you're still listening and that you actually hear this. If not, well, what can I do? We'll all catch up sometime down the road. Take care. And I don't say it often enough, Ant, but you people just be nice to each other. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.